Are you feeling tired, emotionally and physically drained, having troubles concentrating, dealing with brain fog, perhaps not sleeping as well as you could? These, among many other signs, are symptoms of burnout. Now, fatigue, which affects approximately 40% of the population, can be caused by many things. So, more specifically, burnout is defined as a state of mental, physical, and emotional exhaustion due to prolonged stress. So, we will often talk about burnout in the context of work, but that is not the only thing that can burn you out. Sometimes excessive stress due to maybe new parenthood or a really bad relationship or excessive training in sports. All of these different things have a common denominator of putting too much burden and stress, both mental and physical stress, on the body to the point where you can't really cope anymore. And so today, what I want to do for you is I want to more clearly define the signs and symptoms of burnout so you can start to pick up cues in your environment that maybe you're heading in that direction. And then I want to talk to you about some of my absolute favorite tools for prevention and also treating burnout. But before I dive into the signs and symptoms of burnout, I want to just briefly explain to you the mechanism of burnout. How is chronic stress leading to these symptoms of burnout? So, this is really going to help you put into context the things that I talk about. So, some of the signs and symptoms can be explained by these mechanisms, and certainly some of the targets of therapy are explained by these different mechanisms. So, this is just a little bit of brief background so that you can understand why I'm talking about some of the things that I'm talking about. So, when I think about burnout, I think about the effects of stress on two main systems. So, chronic stress mainly will impact your nervous system and your cortisol or your adrenals. So, for example, when we are experiencing stress in our environment, our sympathetic nervous system will kick in. So, this is referring to the two modes of our autonomic nervous system. We have our fight or flight, which is our sympathetic. So this is the one where we get things done. Your heart rate goes up, you're alert, you're ready to fight or flight. Now, the parasympathetic is our rest and digest. And so this is the thing that we do need to kind of balance out with our sympathetic. And so in the example of stress, our sympathetic nervous system will kick in, and then this will cause our brain to release something called ACTH. Now, this chemical will then go down and communicate with your adrenal glands, which are our stress glands. There's a lot of different utility for the adrenals, but one of the main roles of the adrenals is to release our stress hormone cortisol. So when that ACTH signal from the brain makes its way down to the adrenals, it will cause your body to release cortisol. So it starts with your sympathetic nervous system kicking in, and it ends with cortisol going higher. And so these are the two main mechanisms of burnout. You are abusing the system too much. So you are in that sympathetic mode too often. It isn't balanced with the parasympathetic. And a lot of the times, these people become less able to drop back into the parasympathetic when the stress isn't there anymore. And then the other side of it is, what is cortisol doing to the body? What is this excess release of cortisol doing? And sometimes it's not so much about how high or low the cortisol is, but is it releasing too much cortisol at the wrong times? So for example, sleep. And we'll go into this, but I just wanted you to understand that a lot of the symptoms of burnout are due to this abuse of the sympathetic nervous system and the derangements to cortisol. So a lot of the therapies are going to be targeting those two main systems. All right, so now let's dive in to the signs and symptoms of burnout. The first and foremost thing that you need to know is that you do not need to have all of these things in order to be heading in the direction or to be currently in burnout. So a lot of these things you may resonate with and some you may not. It can show up different for different people. And you will also notice that a lot of the things I'm going to mention overlap with other conditions like depression. So this is really where you want to work with someone to make it very clear what's going on. And there's lots of these signs and symptoms. You don't need to have all of them. It can overlap with many other conditions, so you want to be clear on what you're treating and why you're treating it. Okay, so let's dive in to the first sign and symptom, which is the hallmark of burnout, and that is fatigue. So it's usually a mental, physical, and emotional fatigue, like I mentioned earlier. But the mental fatigue can become quite prominent. So one of my favorite things to ask patients is, how long does it take for you to feel awake in the morning, like fully switched on for the day? So from the moment your alarm goes off until you are ready to go. You could start work, you could start your day. So that is what we're referring to as our cortisol awakening response. So this is how quickly our cortisol will peak in the morning, because cortisol is very much involved in helping us feel that mental alertness and helping us wake up for the day. And so if your adrenals or this cortisol system isn't working very efficiently, it can take a long time to start feeling alert in the morning. So these are people who can take longer than 30 minutes, sometimes hours, to feel fully switched on for the day. And then alternatively, some people, if it's too much cortisol too quickly, they kind of wake up in an anxious and alert state. So that's not good either. But either way, these are cues that your cortisol isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing, and that morning fatigue can be very, very prominent in this population. And sometimes it's fatigue all day long and you never feel fully switched on for the day. But that's just one of my tips as to figuring out whether or not your cortisol is at least having its moment in the morning. The next one I want to talk about is a term that gets thrown around a lot, and that is brain fog. So brain fog is referring to struggles with memory, mental clarity, and focus. So some signs that you're starting to struggle with brain fog could be things like you're forgetting things that you normally wouldn't forget. You are having troubles focusing, so maybe you're reading the same paragraph over and over. Maybe you are having troubles making very simple decisions, so indecision can be a sign of burnout. So these are just some of the few signs of brain fog. Another big one can be apathy or disconnect. So you just kind of want to remove yourself from your environment because you're overwhelmed. Your body is trying to get you to become more recluse so that you can recover. So oftentimes you'll notice that you're just not connecting with friends and family like you used to. You don't enjoy going to some of these social engagements or activities. So the disconnect can be very isolating for this population, and it kind of feeds into the cycle of burnout. On a similar line of thinking, you can have a very short emotional bandwidth. So these people can start to get really irritable, very easily triggered by people, just have like a really short fuse because you're tapped out, you're emotionally exhausted. So you don't have the patience that you might normally have. And then another thing that people can struggle with, which is very common in this population, is poor sleep. So even though you are exhausted all day long and looking forward to that bed, when you actually get into bed, a lot of the times people will struggle to fall asleep, or if they do fall asleep, their sleep won't be of high quality. It'll be very broken. Now, a lot of the times, this is because your cortisol is too high at night. So what I was getting at with the morning cortisol is it helps us feel alert. So if you're too alert before bed, this is very much the type of insomnia where all of a sudden you're thinking about these random text message you received a couple weeks ago, what you have to do tomorrow. Oh, I forgot to wash the car. Like things that really shouldn't be popping up into your brain before bed are because your body's not shutting down the way it should. The cortisol isn't dropping the way it should. And cortisol has a antagonistic impact on melatonin. So melatonin, our sleep hormone, is supposed to be high at night, allowing us to fall into this really deep, restful sleep, and cortisol counteracts that. In some extreme cases, you can actually start to notice changes in people's blood pressure. So you can start to pick up on these physiological signs. So not so much what you experience emotionally, but physiologically, you can measure changes within the body in response to burnout. So, yeah, sometimes people will have really low blood pressure, really high blood pressure, or just a blood pressure that is a little bit all over the place because your nervous system isn't regulating it as it could. Now, this last thing I want to mention isn't exactly something that you feel, and I've kind of already talked about it, but this is something that you can measure. So, cortisol, as I mentioned before, is very much involved in this. So, you can have a type of burnout where it's very much low cortisol, so you're just underproducing as a whole, or too much cortisol. So, they can kind of give you insight as to like where the adrenals are in this cycle of burnout. But either way, it can be high or it can be low. So this is where you can get a lot of benefit out of things like saliva testing because A, it picks up your active cortisol, which is what we care about more, is like the hormone that's actually doing things in the body. But more importantly, what it will also pick up is how your cortisol behaves over 24 hours. So, like I said before, we want cortisol high in the morning. It allows us to feel awake and it does many things that kind of help perk us up. But then we want it to slowly peter off throughout the day, being low before bed, allowing that melatonin to kick in, allowing our brain to shut off for the day. And so sometimes it's not so much that you are overall too high or overall too low, but maybe too high at night relative to what your body would like, or too low in the morning. You get what I'm saying. So this is something we can actually measure, which is really helpful. And then the last thing I'm going to mention is something else that we can measure, which is something called heart rate variability. Now, I've talked a lot about this in previous episodes, but basically this is something that is measured with a lot of these devices like Whoop straps, Aura rings, Garmin watches. I think if you get an app, you can also interpret this when it comes to your Apple watches. A lot of these new age devices will look at heart rate variability, which is a reflection of how efficient your nervous system is. So, are you good at switching in and out of sympathetic and parasympathetic? Is your body responding appropriately to the environmental cues? So, when life is stressful, it's good. You need to be able to rev things up to get things done, to solve the problem. But are you able to also rest? And so, heart rate variability should be high, meaning you are very variable, you respond to your environment. And then when your heart rate variability goes low, that can be a sign that you are in burnout or at least heading in the direction of burnout. So this is, again, an objective measure. So we spend a lot of time talking about your experience, but sometimes it's nice to have something that is measured either in the saliva or with one of these devices. Okay, so those are some of the key signs and symptoms. There is never enough time to go over everything. So just know that this isn't a complete list, but these are some of the big ones when it comes to burnout. Now, let's talk about some of the things you can do about it. How do we prevent burnout, and what do we do when we're already in burnout? So I'm going to start by talking about some of the lifestyle things that you can do. So the first one is movement. Now, it might sound counterproductive because if you're tired, you probably don't want to go to the gym, but movement is always helpful. That being said, it very much depends on the type of movement and where you are with your burnout. So when you are in the thick of burnout, high intensity, especially high intensity cardio, is likely not your friend. So this is not the time that you go to that spin class that burns 1,000 calories and just give it all you got, because that might further deplete you. And so when you're really in the thick of it, you might have to opt for gentler movement practices like going for walks or yoga or some of these lower intensity things, because your body just doesn't have the bandwidth to do those high intensity things, and it could further push you into burnout if you're not careful. Now, one of my favorite things to do with this population is to have them wear one of these devices like an Aura ring, because what it will do, it'll track the strain on your body, and it'll tell you if that strain is too much to the point where it's starting to affect things like your HRV and your recovery. So I really like having these devices if you are prone to burnout or if you're already in burnout, because it'll give you a clue as to whether or not you're pushing things too far. Because sometimes it's not always that obvious. Like, am I tired and don't want to go to the gym today because I'm being lazy? Or is it my body's way of telling me that I need to take a step back and focus on recovery today? So these devices can kind of take the guessing out of it. So movement is very important, and I don't think there's ever a time where you completely stop moving and exercising, but you do want to modify it. And if you're not in burnout, maintaining regular exercise is very important. But again, modifying it based on how recovered you are, and maybe not going for really intense exercises on the days that you're already too burdened with high stress, poor sleep, things like that. The second thing I want to talk about is one of my favorite topics. I know it's super trendy, but it's trendy for a good reason, and that is cold water therapy. Now, this one is very controversial when it comes to burnout, because a lot of people would argue when you're burnt out, it's actually not good for you to do cold water therapy. But what I would argue is similar to exercise, is it's more just about modifying the activity as opposed to getting rid of it altogether. So I did a whole episode on cold water therapy. If you want to refer to it, I talk about how to do it, the nuances of it. But in a short summary, basically, you do not need to have it that cold to have an effect. And when you are feeling extremely run down, just a very short, very mild cold can still give your nervous system that benefit without pushing things too far, because it too is a physical stress on the body. Your body is put into a stress mode when you have cold water hitting you, and you are supposed to breathe and regulate through that external stress. Now, of course, when we're really burnt out, our ability to do that can decline, and you don't want to push things too far. So this is one of my favorite tools for prevention. It can be a little bit tricky when you're already in burnout, and I would say you have to do it a lot less often, a lot less cold for shorter periods of time if you do want to maintain the habit. But if you are not burnt out, it teaches your body how to regulate through stress. So it's like practicing and flexing that muscle of like external stress. That's okay. I'm going to regulate and breathe through it and figure out a way to bring down my heart rate and bring myself back into a calmer state despite the stress. All right, so this third thing that I want to talk about is diet. And diet can look so different from person to person. There's so much nuance as to finding the right diet for the right person. But I will say there is one thing in this population I do like to focus on as a general, and that is balancing blood sugars. And so I did a whole video about what that diet looks like and tips and tricks to having steady blood sugars throughout the day. But I'm going to explain to you why I care so much about this in this particular population. So when you have volatile blood sugars, meaning they spike and drop really easily, so maybe you're not full on diabetic or anything, but you do get swings in those blood sugars. When your blood sugars drop past a certain point, your body will go into alert mode because it's dangerous to have low blood sugars. And so what it'll do is it'll release cortisol, because that will help bring those blood sugars back up, because cortisol will go to those sugar stores in places like your liver and your muscles, and it'll pull the sugars out so that we can bring those blood sugars back up. Now, the relationship between cortisol and these sugars goes both ways. So what cortisol will do is it'll release the blood sugar stores and it'll increase your blood glucose levels. So when we're stressed, we actually notice a rise in blood sugars. Even if we don't need to actually go fight a lion, your body doesn't know that. And so it will mobilize the sugars so that you're prepared for anything. So chronic stress will put people at a 2 to 3 times higher risk of developing diabetes. Now that is a huge problem because diabetes and prediabetes is already extremely rampant in the general population. So yeah, there's 2 reasons. The Dips in blood sugars will cause cortisol release. And if you're already chronically releasing a lot of cortisol because of stress, this is just further burdening that system and pushing you into burnout quicker. And then on the flip side, if you have high cortisol and lots of peaks in cortisol, it's going to cause spikes in blood sugar, which puts you at a higher risk of diabetes. So balancing blood sugars in this population is helpful for preventing further consequences of burnout, but also helping manage and hopefully prevent burnout from progressing. This next thing that I want to talk about is referring to something that can actually help in the moment. So when you're experiencing acute stress, your heart rate starting to increase, your mind starting to race, things like that, it can actually be helpful in the moment, which very few things can be. And now I'm talking about respiratory techniques or breathing techniques. Now, this isn't just basic deep breathing. The key here is that you want to be breathing in less than you're breathing out. Now, there are other people who go deep dive into the mechanism of why that's helpful, but to tell you a very simplified version of it, when you're breathing in, it puts you into more of a sympathetic mode. And when you're breathing out, it puts you into more of a parasympathetic mode. So this is because your heart has a node in it called the SA node that detects pressure changes. And when you breathe out, the pressure is decreasing. When you breathe in, the pressure is increasing. You're inflating the lungs. That increased pressure puts your body into more of that fight or flight mode. And when you're breathing out, that decreased pressure puts you into more of that parasympathetic mode. And so some of these techniques like the respiratory sigh, or if you get a little more simple about it, just breathing out twice as long as you breathe in, that can push you into parasympathetic quicker than just basic old deep breathing. So that's something that a lot of people are starting to catch wind of, and it can be very helpful for dealing with stress as it's happening. This last more lifestyle thing that I want to touch upon is things like counseling, journaling, meditation, any sort of psycho-emotional support that you can give yourself is extremely helpful. Now, I'm really going to skim over this one because there are much better qualified people to talk about that, to talk about some of the ways that we can set better boundaries in our life. Is part of your burnout the fact that you don't know how to say no? Is part of your burnout that you don't have a good relationship with your coworkers, with your work-life balance, things like that. So these are things that I think are very, very crucial in the equation of prevention and dealing with burnout in the moment. But I am not going to talk about that in today's episode. Let's leave that to people who can deep dive into it because it's very nuanced, it's very individualized. But I wanted to make sure that you are aware that that is very much part of the equation. If you want to get better, if you want to develop better habits that prevent things from getting to that place, then you are going to want to do some self-work. All right, so I want to end by talking about two of my absolute favorite supplements for burnout. Now, this is by no stretch an extensive list, but these are the two that I probably use the most in this population. So it tends to be helpful for a large percentage of people dealing with burnout. And just know that these are not the only two things out there, but they are the most used in my practice when dealing with this population. The first one is magnesium. Now, the main reason for this is because of how important it is for our nervous system and how quickly chronic stress can deplete magnesium. So magnesium deficiencies are already really rampant in the general population, but they become more rampant in people who deal with chronic stress because our body burns through a lot of magnesium when dealing with stress. So a lot of the physiological processes that happen in reaction to stress are using a lot of magnesium. So we can become very deficient very quickly in this population. And magnesium is extremely helpful for calming the nervous system. So this can be really helpful for people who deal with a lot of anxiety and overstimulation in relation to this whole process. The reason magnesium can be so helpful for bringing things down, calming things down, is because it's been shown to inhibit two of our main excitatory pathways in the brain. So the glutamate pathway and the NMDA pathway, which are our two main excitatory or stimulating pathways, can be quenched by magnesium. And so it can be really helpful for the overstimulated, anxious type of burnout. And then the other thing too is it's really helpful for blocking something called angiotensin 2, which constricts our blood vessels and increases our blood pressure. So for a lot of individuals, the stress will cause our blood pressure to rise, and over time that can lead to hypertension long term. And so the magnesium is going to help with this process. I do like it as a bedtime supplement because it's very calming, but it's not sedative. It's not going to knock you out like a prescription med. And if you want to learn more about the nuances of taking magnesium, I did an entire episode on magnesium because there's so many different forms and considerations when it comes to finding the right magnesium for you. So I would refer to that video for the nuances, but just know that magnesium can be very helpful and it's a very common deficiency in even healthy individuals who eat a very well-rounded diet. Now, the last thing I'm going to mention is one of my all-time favorite herbs, and that is ashwagandha. Ashwagandha is an Ayurvedic herb that has been used for thousands of years for longevity and rejuvenation, and it's very much useful for burnout and helping kind of nourish the body through this process of chronic stress. Now, if you go to look ashwagandha up, you'll notice that there are a ton of claims around it. So I'm just going to stick to the ones that are relevant for burnout. So one of the main things that it does is it's really helpful for lowering cortisol. So I love this as a nighttime supplement for that reason, because if the cortisol is affecting your sleep at night, ashwagandha can be very helpful for lowering that cortisol. So very good for helping you fall asleep quicker and helping you have a higher quality, deeper sleep because of that cortisol equation. Now, the other things that they're finding in the research that can be helpful is it can also increase testosterone in certain individuals. Now, when we look at the whole pathway of how testosterone is produced, it does start with something called DHEA, which ashwagandha has also been shown to be helpful for in select studies. But ultimately, that DHEA can go down a lot in people who are burnt out because it's being produced by the adrenal glands, which are already overwhelmed with producing all of the cortisol. And so this system can start to get really slow and lazy. And because that DHEA is what turns into testosterone, the testosterone levels can also suffer. And if you think back to the symptoms I mentioned earlier, like fatigue, brain fog, things like that, those are also signs of low testosterone. And in the general population, we're starting to notice that testosterone is becoming more and more of an issue in men and women. So ashwagandha is extremely helpful for the cortisol effect that it has, but also for the testosterone effect that it has. And it's also an extremely safe, gentle herb. Now, not everyone's going to react well to it, but either way, it's one of my absolute favorite things. I use a ton of ashwagandha in my practice, and I find it extremely helpful for improving quality of sleep and for improving daytime energy. And it's really going to help with people who are currently in the phase of burnout, as well as helping prevent these things. Now, that is my very quick and very simplified version of how to deal with chronic stress, how to deal with burnout, what to look out for. So I hope that this provided some good foundational information for you. You can always take this many, many steps further. So if you have any follow-up questions, please comment them below. Or if there are any topics that you want me to elaborate on, please also comment those below. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you guys here again soon.